David, after 12 years, we're eliminating your role. My name is David Rutledge. I'm 49 years old, and I spent 12 years building something at Keystone Medical Solutions that nobody else could see. While other procurement officers shuffled papers and chased quarterly savings reports, I built relationships. Real ones. The kind where vendors called my personal cell when hurricanes hit their warehouses, and hospital administrators knew my voice before I said my name. Michelle Harmon sat across from me in that sterile conference room, her satisfied smirk telling me everything I needed to know. She was 37, hired 6 months ago to modernize operations after the merger with North Point Healthcare Group. New leadership meant new ideas. Apparently, loyalty and proven results were old ideas. We've appreciated your service, but the company's moving in a new direction, she continued, sliding a manila folder across the table. Clean out your desk by Thursday. I smiled and nodded. I get it. The HR representative, a nervous woman named Janet, shifted uncomfortably as she explained severance packages and benefits. Michelle checked her phone twice during the meeting. When they asked if I had questions, I shook my head. Thanks for the opportunity, I said, standing up. 12 years was a good run. Michelle's smirk widened. She thought I was taking it well. Broken, defeated, ready to shuffle out quietly like the other veterans she had already pushed aside. What she didn't know was that during the pandemic supply shortages 3 years ago, when hospitals were desperate and vendors were overwhelmed, I had quietly restructured our most critical contracts, not under Keystone Medical Solutions, under David Rutledge Procurement Services, a consulting firm I had registered during the chaos. It was perfectly legal. The hospitals needed supplies. The vendors needed reliable partners. I delivered both. Those relationships weren't built on corporate letterhead. They were built on trust, on late-night phone calls when shipments went missing, on finding alternative suppliers when the usual ones failed, on remembering that the procurement manager at St. Mary's Hospital had a diabetic daughter, and making sure insulin was never back-ordered. I walked back to my desk and started packing. 12 years of industry awards went into a cardboard box. Photos of my late wife, Catherine, went carefully into my briefcase. The Rolodex stayed right where it was. Let them figure out what those phone numbers meant. My cell phone buzzed. A text from Tony Valdez at Harrison Medical Supply. Heard rumors about changes at Keystone. Everything okay? I typed back. All good. Might have some interesting news soon. Michelle walked past my cubicle, probably checking to make sure I wasn't stealing office supplies. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. I started at Keystone right after Catherine died. Needed something to focus on besides the empty house and the medical bills. Procurement wasn't glamorous, but it made sense. Find what people need. Get it to them reliably. Build systems that work. The first few years were about learning the business. Medical supplies weren't like office equipment or construction materials. When a hospital ran out of surgical sutures, people died. When ventilator parts were back-ordered, families suffered. I took that seriously. My first major success came during a shortage of cardiac stents in 2018. Our usual supplier had manufacturing issues, and 3 of our hospital partners were facing surgery delays. I spent a weekend calling every contact I could find, finally locating surplus inventory at a distributor in Phoenix. I drove there myself, loaded my pickup truck, and delivered them directly to the hospitals. That's when I realized something important. The vendors didn't care about Keystone Medical Solutions. They cared about the person who solved their problems and paid their invoices on time. Me. Over the years, I cultivated those relationships deliberately. Christmas cards to their families, remembering their kids' names, flying to trade shows not to collect brochures but to have dinner with people I trusted. When COVID hit and supply chains collapsed, those relationships saved us. While other medical distributors fought over scraps, I had suppliers holding inventory specifically for my hospitals. Not because of contract terms, but because they knew I would take care of them when things got better. Michelle Harmon arrived 6 months ago with an MBA from Northwestern and ideas about supply chain optimization. She looked at my vendor relationships and saw inefficiency. Too much personal contact, too many phone calls, too much trust, not enough data analytics. We need to modernize, she told me during our first meeting. Automate vendor management, centralize purchasing decisions, reduce redundant relationships. I nodded and kept doing my job. But I started noticing small changes. My access to certain purchase orders was restricted. Vendor meetings were scheduled without including me. New contracts were being negotiated by people who had never spoken to the suppliers. Last month, I overheard Michelle on a phone call with the regional vice president. David's methods are outdated, she said. He's too emotionally attached to these vendors. We can cut costs by 30% with competitive bidding. That's when I knew my time was limited. Not because I was failing, but because I was succeeding in ways that MBA textbooks didn't recognize. I made some quiet phone calls, updated some paperwork, made sure certain relationships were properly documented under the right legal entities. Michelle thought she was eliminating dead weight. She had no idea she was about to learn the difference between managing a supply chain and actually knowing one. Thursday afternoon, I loaded the last box into my truck and walked out of Keystone Medical Solutions for the final time. The security guard, Marcus, shook my hand at the door. "Heard about the changes," he said quietly. "Sorry to see you go, Mr. Rutledge." "Thanks, Marcus. Take care of yourself." I drove home to my house in Cedar Rapids and sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. 12 years of work reduced to 3 cardboard boxes in my hallway. Catherine's photo smiled at me from the mantel. She would have found this whole situation grimly amusing. 30 years of marriage, and you still don't see things coming until they hit you, she used to say. But this time, I had seen it coming, and I had prepared. My phone rang. Jerry Morrison from Midwest Surgical Supply. "David, heard through the grapevine that you might be making some changes," he said. "Wanted to touch base." "Actually, Jerry, I'm thinking about going independent, focusing on what I do best." "Consulting?" "Something like that. Question for you. If I started my own logistics firm, would Midwest be interested in exclusive partnership agreements? Better terms than what you have with the big distributors?" Jerry was quiet for a moment. "David, you know damn well that 90% of our business comes through relationships you built. If you're asking whether we'd rather work with you directly or deal with whatever corporate robot they put in your place, that's not even a question." I made 6 more calls that evening. Same conversation, same response. By Friday morning, I had commitments from every major supplier I had worked with for the past decade, not just to do business with my new company, but to terminate their existing contracts with Keystone Medical Solutions. The beautiful thing about vendor relationships in the medical supply industry is that most contracts have 30-day termination clauses, standard protection for both sides. Vendors can't be locked into deals with unreliable distributors, and distributors can't be stuck with suppliers who don't perform. What Michelle didn't understand was that those vendors had been doing business with me, not with Keystone. When I left, the relationships left with me. I spent Saturday setting up David Rutledge Healthcare Logistics in my spare bedroom, business license, insurance, bank accounts. By Sunday evening, I had a functioning company. Monday morning, I sent out termination notices. 5 major suppliers, 30-day notice, professional, courteous, and completely legal. Then I sat back and waited. Michelle was about to discover that firing the guy who built your entire supply chain was like firing the foundation of your building. Everything else just falls down. Tuesday morning, Michelle Harmon walked into her office expecting a routine day of optimizing operations. Instead, she found her assistant holding a stack of overnight faxes and looking concerned. "These came in this morning," she said. "Contract terminations." Michelle glanced at the first page. Harrison Medical Supply. 30-day termination notice, effective immediately for new orders. The second page was worse. Midwest Surgical Supply. Same notice. By the third page, Michelle's hands were shaking. 5 of their largest vendors, all terminating on the same day. She grabbed her phone and called Harrison Medical Supply. "Tony Valdez, please. This is Michelle Harmon from Keystone Medical Solutions." "Tony's in a meeting," the receptionist said. "Can I take a message?" "This is about the termination notice. There must be some mistake." "No mistake. Mr. Valdez was very clear about the decision." I need to speak with him today. This is urgent. I'll pass along the message. The line went dead. Michelle tried Midwest Surgical next. Jerry Morrison wasn't available. Neither was the account manager or the regional director. By noon, she had called every terminated vendor. None of them would take her calls. She pulled up the vendor files on her computer looking for leverage, contract terms, penalty clauses, anything that could force them to honor their agreements. What she found made her stomach drop. Every major contract had been renegotiated during 2022. During the pandemic supply shortages, all of them included 30-day termination clauses with no penalties, standard industry practice for medical supplies. But there was something else. The contact person listed on every contract wasn't Keystone Medical Solutions. It was David Rutledge, Senior Procurement Specialist. Michelle stared at her screen. She had fired the guy whose name was on every critical vendor relationship, the guy who had apparently structured those relationships to be portable. Her phone rang. Regional Vice President Harrison Clark. Michelle, I'm getting calls from 3 hospital systems. They're asking about supply chain disruptions. What's going on? We had some vendor contract issues. I'm handling it. Handling it how? St. Mary's Hospital says their surgical supply order was just canceled. They have procedures scheduled for next week. Michelle felt sweat on her forehead. I'll call them back and straighten this out. You better. If we lose hospital contracts because of supply chain failures, heads are going to roll. After Clark hung up, Michelle sat in her office trying to process what was happening. David Rutledge had been fired on Monday. By Tuesday, their entire supply network was falling apart. She called Human Resources. Janet, I need David Rutledge's personal contact information. We have some follow-up questions about his vendor relationships. I can't give out personal information on former employees. Company policy. This is business critical. We're having supply chain issues. You'll need to go through legal for that kind of request. Michelle hung up and called legal. They told her it would take at least a week to process the request. Maybe longer. She tried a different approach. Called David's old desk extension, hoping someone in procurement might have his personal number. That number's been disconnected, the receptionist said. David Rutledge no longer works here. By Wednesday morning, the situation was spiraling. 2 more hospital systems had called to complain about canceled orders. The regional manager from North Point Healthcare Group was demanding answers. Michelle finally swallowed her pride and tried calling information for David Rutledge's home number in Cedar Rapids. The number you have requested is unlisted. She slammed the phone down and stared at the termination notices spread across her desk. 5 vendors, hundreds of thousands of dollars in monthly orders, all gone because she had fired one man. The man who had apparently built the entire system she was supposed to be managing. Wednesday afternoon, Michelle decided to visit some of the vendors in person. If they wouldn't take her calls, maybe face-to-face meetings would work. Her first stop was Harrison Medical Supply, a warehouse facility 20 minutes outside Cedar Rapids. She walked into the lobby, wearing her best business suit and carrying a briefcase full of contract amendments she had prepared. I'm here to see Tony Valdez, she told the receptionist. Michelle Harmon from Keystone Medical Solutions. The receptionist made a phone call, spoke quietly for a moment, then hung up. Mr. Valdez isn't available. I drove here specifically to resolve our contract situation. This is important. I understand, but he's not available. Michelle waited in the lobby for an hour, watching employees walk past, seeing trucks load and unload medical supplies that used to be destined for her hospitals. Finally, a man in his 50s walked out. Stocky build, work boots, clipboard in hand. You Michelle Harmon? Yes. Are you Tony Valdez? I am. Walk with me. He led her outside to the loading dock where workers were moving boxes of surgical instruments. Let me save us both some time, Tony said. We're not resuming business with Keystone Medical Solutions. That decision is final. Can you tell me why? We've had a good relationship for years. Tony stopped walking and looked at her directly. Lady, we never had a relationship with Keystone Medical Solutions. We had a relationship with David Rutledge. When you fired David, you fired our business partnership. But the contracts were written to protect both sides. David made sure of that during the pandemic when everyone was scrambling. He told us that if anything ever happened to him, we wouldn't be stuck dealing with people who didn't understand the business. Michelle felt a chill. What do you mean if anything happened to him? David's been in this industry for 20 years. He's seen companies get bought and sold, seen good people get pushed out by corporate types who think spreadsheets are more important than relationships. He protected us from that. We can offer better terms, more volume, competitive pricing. Tony shook his head. You don't get it. This isn't about money. It's about trust. David spent 12 years proving he was reliable. When hospitals needed supplies during COVID, he drove them himself. When our warehouse flooded in 2021, he helped us find temporary storage. When my son needed surgery last year, David made sure we had priority access to the cardiac supplies. Michelle listened, beginning to understand the scope of what she had lost. You fired the guy who built our entire business relationship, Tony continued. Now you want us to trust you instead? Lady, we don't even know you. Where is David now? Tony smiled for the first time during their conversation. Starting his own company, David Rutledge Healthcare Logistics, were his first client. Michelle drove back to the office in stunned silence. She had thought David was just another employee, a procurement specialist who ordered supplies and managed vendor paperwork. What she had actually fired was the human foundation of their entire business model. By Thursday morning, she had a clearer picture of the disaster. Every vendor who had terminated their contracts was now working exclusively with David's new company. Every hospital system that depended on those supplies was asking pointed questions about Keystone's ability to fulfill their orders. The regional vice president called an emergency meeting for Friday. Michelle spent Thursday night updating her resume. Friday morning, Michelle sat in the conference room with Regional Vice President Harrison Clark and 3 other executives from North Point Healthcare Group. The mood was grim. Explain to me how we lost 5 major vendors in 1 week, Clark said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Michelle had prepared for this moment. She opened her folder and laid out the vendor termination notices. It appears that our former employee, David Rutledge, structured these contracts in a way that made them portable. When we terminated his employment, the vendors chose to follow him to his new company. His new company. David Rutledge Healthcare Logistics. He registered it the day after we fired him. Clark studied the termination notices. These are all perfectly legal. 30-day notice periods, no penalty clauses, standard industry practice. Yes. And you fired the guy who negotiated all of these contracts? Michelle felt the room getting smaller. We were restructuring the procurement department. His position was eliminated as part of cost-cutting measures. Cost-cutting measures. Clark set down the papers and looked directly at her. Michelle, do you understand what you've done? Before she could answer, her assistant knocked on the conference room door. Sorry to interrupt. Mr. Clark, you have an urgent call from St. Mary's Hospital. Clark took the call in the conference room. Michelle and the other executives listened to one side of the conversation. I understand. Yes, we're aware of the supply chain issues. No, we don't have an alternative supplier lined up yet. How long can you wait? When he hung up, Clark's expression was dangerous. St. Mary's is our largest hospital contract, 60% of our regional revenue. They have surgical procedures scheduled for next week that require supplies from Harrison Medical, supplies we can no longer provide. We can find alternative vendors. In how long? With what kind of pricing? And what guarantee that they'll be reliable? Michelle had no good answers. Clark continued. I called the other hospital systems this morning. They're all asking the same questions. How did we lose our entire supply chain overnight? What's our contingency plan? Why should they trust us with their medical supply needs if we can't maintain vendor relationships? The silence in the room was heavy. There's more, Michelle's assistant said from the doorway. David Rutledge called. He's offering to meet with us. Clark looked up sharply. He wants to meet. When? This afternoon, if possible. He said he has a proposal that might help resolve the supply chain disruptions. Michelle felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that maybe they could salvage the situation. Dread that David was now in a position to dictate terms. "Set up the meeting," Clark said. 2:00. After the executives left, Michelle sat alone in the conference room. Her cost-cutting measure had turned into a company-threatening crisis in less than a week. The man she had fired with such satisfaction was now the only person who could save their business. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Michelle, this is David. Looking forward to our meeting this afternoon. Come prepared to discuss partnership terms. The vendors are willing to resume service to Keystone's hospital clients, but only through my company as the primary distributor. We'll need to work out the details." Michelle stared at the message. David wasn't offering to come back as an employee. He was offering to become their supplier. The man she had eliminated to cut costs was about to become their most expensive vendor. At exactly 2 p.m., David Rutledge walked into the Keystone Medical Solutions conference room wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He looked calm, professional, and completely in control. Michelle sat across from him, flanked by Harrison Clark and the legal team, the same conference room where she had fired him exactly 1 week earlier. "David," Clark said, "thank you for coming. We understand you might be able to help us resolve these vendor relationship issues." David opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I can do more than help. I can solve the problem completely. My vendors are willing to resume supplying all of Keystone's hospital clients immediately." Michelle felt a surge of hope. "However," David continued, "they'll only do business through David Rutledge Healthcare Logistics. I'll serve as the primary distributor. You'll purchase all medical supplies through my company." Clark leaned forward. "What kind of terms are we talking about?" David slid a contract across the table. "Standard distributor markup is 15%. Given the urgency of the situation and the specialized relationships involved, my markup will be 25%. Michelle's heart sank. 25% markup on hundreds of thousands of dollars in monthly orders meant David would be making more as their vendor than he ever had as their employee. "That seems excessive," she said. David looked at her with the same calm smile he had given her when she fired him. "Michelle, a week ago I was a cost to be eliminated. Today I'm the only solution to your supply chain crisis. The market determines value." Clark studied the contract. "These terms are actually reasonable for exclusive distributor relationships. How quickly can you restore service?" "Vendor relationships will be reactivated within 24 hours. Hospital deliveries resume Monday morning. All existing quality standards maintained." "And the legal structure protects both companies?" "Completely. My vendors trust me. Your hospitals get their supplies. Everyone wins." Clark signed the contract without further discussion. David shook hands with everyone in the room. When he reached Michelle, he held her gaze for a moment. "Thanks for the opportunity," he said. "Sometimes the best business decisions look like mistakes at first." 6 months later, David Rutledge Healthcare Logistics had grown from a spare bedroom operation to a regional medical supply powerhouse. The vendor relationships he had cultivated over 12 years became the foundation for contracts with hospital systems across 3 states. Michelle Harmon lasted another 2 months at Keystone Medical Solutions before accepting a position with a software company in Chicago. The supply chain crisis had been resolved, but her reputation as a manager was irreparably damaged. David kept the business simple. No corporate headquarters, no layers of management, just reliable people delivering essential supplies to places where they mattered most. He hired 3 employees, 2 logistics coordinators, and 1 administrative assistant. All of them came from his old contacts in the industry. People who understood that medical supply chains weren't about optimizing spreadsheets, but about making sure a cardiac surgeon never had to cancel a procedure because the right stent wasn't available. On a Thursday evening in November, David sat in his home office reviewing the week's delivery reports. Every hospital order fulfilled on time. Every vendor payment processed promptly. No emergencies, no crises. No angry phone calls from administrators whose patients were waiting for supplies. His phone rang. Tony Valdez from Harrison Medical Supply. "David, got a minute? We're thinking about expanding into the Kansas City market. Interested in growing the partnership? Always interested in good business, Tony. Send me the proposal. After he hung up, David looked at Catherine's photo on his desk. She would have been proud. Not because he had gotten revenge on the people who fired him, but because he had built something better from what they threw away. Sometimes the best response to being undervalued is proving your worth on your own terms.